10 silver says he won't even last an hour outside those chains, someone muttered, and the laughter that followed rolled across the market like dry leaves scraping over stone, thin and cruel, and far too familiar to Elena Whitmore as she stepped into the iron square with her hand curled tightly around the last coin she owned, the metal warm from her skin and yet feeling heavier than anything she had ever carried before, heavier than the threadbare shawl around her shoulders, heavier than the years of being told she was nothing, because today those coins were not just money, they were a choice she could not take back. The air smelled like rust and damp wood, like rain that never quite washed anything clean, and the wooden platform at the center stood under a pale gray sky, its surface scarred from years of use. Chains coiled across it like sleeping serpents while people pressed close in thick rows, their voices rising and falling in casual indifference as if this were just another morning market, just another transaction, just another life weighed and dismissed. And Elena kept her eyes low at first, the way she had been taught, the way an Omega learned to survive in a world that preferred her quiet, invisible, useful only when needed and easily ignored when not. But something in the air pulled at her, a tension that didn't belong to the laughter or the bargaining, something sharper, colder, like the moment before a storm breaks, and she felt it before she saw him. Step aside if you're not buying. A man barked somewhere near her shoulder, his tone dismissive, and she shifted without protest, moving along the edge of the crowd, her worn boots scraping against uneven boards as she tried to make herself smaller. But then the crowd parted just enough for her to see the center of the platform, and everything else seemed to fall quiet in her mind, the noise fading into a distant hum because there, kneeling in iron restraints that looked too heavy for any one person to bear, was a man who did not look broken. His posture was straight despite the weight on his wrists, his head slightly lowered but not bowed, not in submission, not in defeat, and even from several yards away Elena could see the tension held in the line of his shoulders, not weakness but restraint, like something powerful held tightly beneath the surface. And the longer she looked, the more wrong it felt, because men in chains were supposed to shrink, to flinch, to beg or glare, or collapse inward under the weight of being seen as less than human. But he did none of those things. He simply existed in the center of it all, like the world around him did not quite have the authority to define him. Starting bid, 10 silver. The auctioneer called, his voice practiced and bored, and a few half-hearted chuckles answered him, someone tossing out a lower number as if testing how little they could get away with paying. And Elena felt her fingers tighten around her coins as she watched the way the man remained still, not reacting to the voices, not acknowledging the insults tossed casually his way. And for a moment, she wondered if he could even hear them, if he had retreated somewhere deeper, just to endure. But then his head lifted slightly, just enough for a flicker of light to catch his eyes, and the breath caught in her throat because there was nothing empty there, nothing distant or defeated, only awareness, sharp and unyielding. And it hit her with a quiet certainty that she did not understand, a sense that whatever story the crowd believed they were witnessing was not the truth at all. 5 silver, someone called, and more laughter followed, louder now, emboldened by the lack of interest, by the ease of dismissing what they did not understand. And Elena felt the weight of her coins again, felt the rough edge of one pressing into her palm, grounding her in the reality she had always known, that she had no place in decisions like this, no power to change outcomes that had already been decided by people stronger, louder, more important than her. And yet her gaze did not leave the man on the platform, because something about the way he held himself refused to fit inside the world she had been taught to accept. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet voice inside her that she had learned to ignore whispered that maybe, just maybe, the world was wrong about him. And if it was wrong about him, then it had been wrong about other things too, including her. And that thought, fragile and dangerous, settled in her chest as the bidding dropped lower and lower, as the crowd lost interest, as the moment edged closer to something final. And Elena Whitmore stood there with her last coins pressed into her palm, realizing that walking away would be easy, expected, safe, and completely impossible. The coin in Elena Whitmore's hand felt impossibly loud as it shifted against the others, a faint metallic clink that seemed to echo far beyond her fingers, and she tightened her grip instinctively. as if even that small sound might draw attention she could not afford, because attention in a place like this was never kind, never forgiving, and yet her eyes refused to leave the man on the platform, drawn back to him again and again despite every instinct that told her to look away, to step back, to disappear the way she always had. Going once, the auctioneer called, his voice carrying easily over the thinning crowd, and there was impatience in it now, the kind that came when something failed to entertain, failed to profit, failed to matter, and Elena felt something twist in her chest at that, a quiet, stubborn resistance she did not fully understand, because she had lived her entire life being told what did and did not matter, and she had always accepted it, had always folded herself into the expectations placed upon her. But this felt different. This felt wrong in a way that pressed against her ribs until it became impossible to ignore. A man beside her scoffed, shaking his head as he glanced toward the platform. Not worth the trouble, he muttered to no one in particular, and a few others nodded in agreement, their attention already drifting toward other stalls, other distractions, as if the figure in chains had already faded into something forgettable, something beneath notice, and Elena swallowed, her throat suddenly dry, because she knew that look, she knew that dismissal, had felt it settle over her like dust more times than she could count, and for a moment she wondered if that was what truly held her in place, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. The auctioneer lifted his hand slightly, preparing to call it, to close the moment with a practiced finality, and Elena felt her pulse quicken, a steady rhythm building beneath her skin as her thoughts tangled together, logic pushing against instinct, fear pressing hard against something quieter but stronger, something that whispered that if she turned away now, she would carry that choice with her for the rest of her life. She shifted her weight, her boots scraping softly against the worn boards, and the movement drew a glance from someone nearby, a sharp look that lingered just long enough to remind her of her place, of how easily she could be judged, dismissed, corrected, and her shoulders tensed under the familiar pressure, but still she did not step back. On the platform, the man moved again, just a fraction, his gaze lifting fully this time, and when it met hers there was no confusion, no hesitation, only a directness that struck deeper than any words could have, as if he saw her not as the others did but as something solid, something real, and the shock of it made her breath catch because no one had ever looked at her that way before, not with that kind of quiet certainty. Last call, the auctioneer said, his tone flattening, ready to end it, ready to move on, and the word last seemed to echo inside Elena's chest, stretching out the moment until it felt impossibly fragile, balanced on the edge of something irreversible, and she realized with sudden clarity that this was not just about him, not just about the stranger in chains, but about her, about whether she would remain exactly as the world expected her to be or take a step into something unknown and uncertain and terrifying. Her fingers loosened slightly around the coins, the cool metal pressing into her skin as if reminding her of what they represented, the meals she would not eat, the nights that would grow colder without them, the safety she would be giving up. And for a heartbeat she hesitated, her mind racing through every consequence, every risk, every reason to stay silent. But beneath all of that there was a single, steady truth that refused to be buried, that she could not stand here and do nothing while someone who did not belong to this fate was reduced to it. Her hand lifted before she fully realized she had made the decision, her voice following a split second later, softer than the others but clear enough to cut through the fading noise. "I will take him," she said, and the words hung in the air, simple and unadorned and completely unexpected. And for a moment, everything stilled around her, as if the market itself had paused to listen, to understand what had just happened, and Elena felt the weight of every gaze turning toward her, felt the sharp edge of surprise and disbelief, and something close to ridicule pressing in from all sides. But she did not lower her hand, did not take the words back, because the moment had already passed, the choice already made, and whatever came next, she would face it standing exactly where she was. For a heartbeat no one moved, and then the market exhaled all at once, a ripple of laughter breaking through the stillness, low at first, and then growing sharper as disbelief turned into amusement, because it was easier to laugh than to question what they had just heard, and Elena Whitmore felt the sound press against her like a physical thing. The familiar sting of being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons tightening across her shoulders, but she did not lower her hand, did not take a step back, even as someone close behind her let out a short, incredulous breath. "You." A voice scoffed, rough with mockery, and she did not need to turn to know the expression that accompanied it. Had seen it too many times in reflections and passing glances, that mixture of pity and dismissal that always seemed to follow her. And for a moment her fingers trembled slightly around the coin she still held, the small weight of them suddenly feeling impossibly fragile against the weight of every eye now fixed on her. The auctioneer blinked, his expression shifting from boredom to something more alert as he leaned forward slightly, as if reassessing the situation entirely, his gaze sweeping over her worn clothing, the faded fabric at her sleeves, the careful way she held herself, as if trying to occupy less space than she actually did. And Elena felt the heat rise faintly in her chest under that scrutiny, but she forced herself to meet it, to stand there without shrinking, because she had already crossed the line she had never dared approach before. "Do you even have enough?" the auctioneer asked, his tone no longer dismissive but edged with curiosity. And a few chuckles followed the question as if the answer were already obvious, as if the idea itself were part of the entertainment. And Elena swallowed, her throat tight, because the truth of it sat heavily in her palm. Every coin she had, every small piece of security she had managed to hold on to, all of it pressed into that single moment, and she slowly opened her hand, letting the dull silver catch what little light filtered through the gray sky above. "It is all I have," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. And the honesty of it seemed to settle differently over the crowd, the laughter faltering just slightly, as something quieter moved beneath it, something less certain. A murmur passed through those closest to her, a shift in tone that Elena could not quite define, and she felt it ripple outward as the auctioneer studied the coins, weighing them with his eyes before glancing back toward the platform, toward the man who had not moved since her words broke the silence. And for the first time since she had spoken, Elena became acutely aware of him again, of the presence that had drawn her in from the beginning, and she turned her gaze back to him almost instinctively. He was watching her, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with that same steady awareness that had unsettled her before, as if her choice had not shocked him at all, as if he had known it would happen long before she did. And the thought sent a faint, unexplainable chill through her, because there was something in that gaze that did not belong to this place, did not belong to chains or auctions or the careless cruelty of a crowd that had already decided his worth. "Well," the auctioneer said slowly, drawing the moment back into motion, "a bid is a bid." And his voice carried again, louder now, addressing the crowd as much as her. "Unless anyone wishes to offer more." But the challenge hung unanswered, the earlier indifference now tangled with uncertainty, because what had once seemed unimportant now carried a different weight, a different tension, and no one stepped forward to claim it. No one raised a voice to counter hers. Elena felt the shift without fully understanding it, felt the way the air seemed to tighten around the platform, as if something unseen had begun to gather, and her pulse quickened. Again, not with fear exactly, but with the sense that she had stepped into something far larger than she had intended, something that was still unfolding. The auctioneer waited a beat longer before nodding once, a decisive motion that cut through the murmurs. "Sold," he declared, and the word landed with a finality that echoed far beyond the simple exchange it represented, and Elena's breath left her slowly, the reality of what she had done settling into her chest, heavy and undeniable. A few scattered laughs followed, softer now, less certain, and someone muttered something under their breath as they turned away, already losing interest in a story that had taken a turn they had not expected. But Elena remained where she was, her attention fixed on the platform as the auctioneer gestured for the transaction to be completed, as if the rest of the world had fallen away entirely. For a moment, nothing changed, and then the man in chains shifted, rising just enough to bring himself to his feet despite the restraints that should have made the movement difficult, and the simple act carried a quiet authority that did not belong to someone who had just been purchased, did not belong to someone who was supposed to be owned. And Elena felt her breath catch again, not in fear but in recognition, because whatever she had just done, whatever choice she had made, it had not been a mistake. It had been the beginning of something she could no longer step away from. The sound of the word sold still lingered in the air when Elena Whitmore finally took a step forward, her boots moving across the worn boards with a quiet steadiness that did not match the storm building inside her chest, because now that the moment had passed, now that the choice was no longer just a thought but a reality, she could feel every consequence settling into place around her, each one heavier than the last. And yet there was no space left for doubt, no path backward to the girl who would have lowered her gaze and walked away. The crowd shifted slightly to let her through, not out of kindness but curiosity, their eyes following her with a sharper interest than before, as if they were waiting to see how this strange, unexpected decision would unfold. And Elena kept her focus forward, toward the platform, toward the man she had just claimed in a way that still felt impossible to fully comprehend. The auctioneer gestured impatiently as she approached, his earlier amusement replaced by a more practical urgency, because to him this was simply a transaction that needed to be completed, nothing more. And he extended a hand expectantly, and Elena hesitated only for a fraction of a second before placing her coins into his palm, feeling the last trace of her security leave her grasp in a single, irreversible motion. The coins made a soft, final sound as they settled into his hand, and with it something inside her shifted as well, a quiet line crossed that she could never uncross, and she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself as she turned her attention fully to the man now standing just a few feet away, up close. The difference was undeniable, the way he held himself, the way the air around him seemed to carry a subtle weight that she could not explain, and she became acutely aware of the space between them, of the faint pull that had drawn her here, now feeling stronger, more defined, as if something unseen had tightened its hold. The chains at his wrists and ankles caught the light dully, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet strength in his posture. And for a moment Elena wondered how anyone could look at him and see something to be discarded, something to be sold. But then she remembered the laughter, the indifference, the ease with which people chose not to see, and the thought settled heavily in her chest. "Take him and move along," the auctioneer said, already turning away, his attention shifting to the next matter as if this moment had already lost its value. And Elena nodded slightly, though she was not entirely sure what taking him even meant in this context, because nothing about this situation felt ordinary. Nothing fit the simple structure of ownership that the market tried to impose. She stepped closer, close enough now to see the fine details she had missed before. The subtle tension in his hands, the way his gaze did not waver as it met hers again, steady and searching in a way that made her pulse quicken. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the noise of the market fading into the background as the space between them seemed to narrow into something more focused, more intense. Elena became aware of her own breathing, the slight tremor she tried to keep from showing, because despite everything, despite the certainty that had driven her to act, she was still standing in front of a stranger, still stepping into something she did not understand, and yet she did not feel fear the way she expected to, only a quiet anticipation, as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and unseen. "You chose," he said at last, his voice low and even, carrying a calm that did not belong to this place. And the simple statement sent a faint shiver through her, not because of the words themselves but because of the weight behind them, as if he were acknowledging something deeper than the act of purchase, something that reached beyond the surface of what anyone else could see. Elena swallowed, her gaze holding his as she nodded once, the movement small but deliberate, and for a moment she searched for something to say, some explanation or reassurance, but nothing felt adequate. Nothing seemed to fit the gravity of what had just happened. "I did," she replied finally, her voice quiet but steady. And the words felt like a confirmation not just to him but to herself, a grounding in the reality she had stepped into. His expression did not change in any obvious way, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of something she could not quite name, something that made her heart beat a little faster, as if it recognized a pattern she had not yet fully seen. Around them, the market had already begun to move on, voices rising again as new distractions took hold. But the space they occupied remained oddly still, insulated from the chaos by something unseen, Elena reached out slowly, not fully thinking through the gesture, her hand moving toward the chain at his wrist as if to understand it, to confirm its reality. And the moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, she felt it, a faint, unexpected warmth threading through. The contact, subtle but undeniable, and her breath caught as her gaze snapped back to his. Because whatever she had just touched, whatever she had just awakened, it was not something that belonged to the simple transaction she had just completed. It was something else entirely, something that had only just begun. The warmth that traveled through the chain did not fade when Elena Whitmore pulled her hand back. It lingered in her fingertips like a quiet echo, subtle but persistent, and she stared at the metal for a brief second, as if expecting it to explain itself. But it remained dull and unremarkable, just another piece of iron to anyone else watching. And yet she knew what she had felt, knew it had not been imagined, because it had moved through her too clearly, too deliberately, as if something on the other side of that contact had responded. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his again, and this time the stillness between them felt different, charged in a way that made her heartbeat shift into something deeper, more aware, as though every sense she had was quietly sharpening without her permission. He had not stepped back, had not reacted with surprise or confusion, and that alone unsettled her more than anything else, because it suggested that whatever had just happened was not new to him, not unexpected, and the thought curled quietly in her mind as she searched his expression for answers that did not come. Around them, the market noise returned in fragments, voices rising and falling, footsteps moving away, the world continuing as if nothing unusual had occurred. But Elena could not shake the feeling that she had stepped slightly outside of it, into a space that did not follow the same rules. "You should leave," a voice cut in from the side, sharp and impatient, and she turned just enough to see one of the market handlers watching her with a mixture of irritation and dismissal, his arms crossed as if eager to clear the space, to restore the normal rhythm of the day. And Elena nodded faintly, though her attention did not fully shift away from the man in front of her. She hesitated for a brief moment, uncertain of the next step, because ownership was something she had only ever observed from a distance, never something she had participated in, and the idea of directing him, of leading him away, felt strange in a way she could not easily define. "Can you walk?" she asked quietly, the question leaving her before she had time to reconsider it. And the moment the words settled between them, she became aware of how they sounded, how they echoed the same assumptions everyone else had made, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed her expression before she could hide it. His gaze remained steady on hers, and for a heartbeat he said nothing, as if weighing the question not for its content, but for what lay beneath it. And then he inclined his head slightly, a small, controlled movement that carried far more composure than anything else in this place. "I can," he replied, his voice calm, almost measured, and there was no strain in it, no hint of weakness, only a quiet certainty that made Elena's chest tighten slightly with a feeling she could not quite name. She nodded again, more to herself this time, and turned toward the edge of the platform, stepping down carefully as the uneven boards shifted under her weight. And she did not look back immediately, did not check if he followed, because something in her told her that he would, that he did not need guidance in the way others might. And the thought settled into her awareness with a strange kind of trust that she had not consciously chosen. A moment later, she heard the faint sound of movement behind her, the subtle shift of metal against metal as he stepped forward, and the noise drew a few glances from those still lingering nearby, curiosity flickering briefly before fading again. Because to them this was no longer worth their attention, just another completed exchange. Elena moved through the thinning crowd, her steps steady despite the tension still coiled beneath her skin, and she became aware of the space he occupied behind her, not through sound or sight, but through something more instinctive, a presence that felt anchored and controlled, never crowding, never uncertain. And it made her acutely aware of her own movements, of the rhythm of her breathing, of the way her thoughts had begun to shift around him without her fully understanding why. They reached the edge of the market square where the noise softened slightly, replaced by the distant murmur of the surrounding streets, and Elena slowed, her steps faltering just enough to betray the uncertainty she had been holding back, because now that they had left the platform behind, The reality of what came next pressed forward with quiet insistence, and she realized she had no plan beyond the decision she had already made. She turned then, facing him fully for the first time away from the weight of the crowd, and the space between them felt clearer here, less crowded by noise and movement, allowing her to see him more fully, to notice the details she had only glimpsed before, and the same quiet realization returned, stronger now, that he did not belong to the role that had been forced upon him, that whatever he was, it extended far beyond the boundaries of this place. She began, the word catching slightly as she searched for something to say that made sense in a moment that did not follow any rules she understood, and then she paused, drawing in a steady breath as she met his gaze again, because whatever came next would not be simple, would not be easy, but it would be real in a way she had never allowed herself to step into before, and she felt that truth settle into her with a quiet, unshakable clarity as the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming began to close. Elena Whitmore let the unfinished word fall away as the silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something unspoken, something that seemed to wait rather than demand, and she found herself holding his gaze longer than she had intended, as if looking away would mean missing something important that had not yet revealed itself. The air here felt different from the market, thinner somehow, less crowded with noise and expectation, and yet her awareness had only sharpened, every small detail standing out with unusual clarity, the faint breeze brushing against her skin, the distant murmur of voices blending into a soft background hum, and beneath it all, the steady presence of the man in front of her, grounded and unmoving in a way that felt deliberate. "You should not have done that," he said at last, his voice low but not unkind, and the words might have sounded like a warning if not for the calm way he delivered them, as if he were stating a fact rather than passing judgment, and Elena felt a flicker of something in her chest at that, not regret, not quite, but an awareness of the weight behind her decision. She drew in a quiet breath, her fingers curling slightly at her sides as she considered his words, because there were 100 reasons he could be right, 100 ways this could unfold into something difficult or dangerous, and yet none of those reasons felt strong enough to undo what had already been set in motion. "I know," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the faint tension still threading through her, and the honesty of it seemed to settle between them in a way that did not need further explanation, because she did. No, she understood the risk even if she could not yet define it. His gaze shifted slightly, not away from her but deeper, as if he were looking past the surface of her answer into something more complex beneath it. And for a moment, she had the strange sensation of being seen in a way that reached beyond words, beyond the small defenses she had built over years of being overlooked. "Then why?" he asked, and the question was simple, direct, and impossible to answer with anything shallow. Because there was no single reason she could offer that would capture the truth of it, no explanation that would make sense in the narrow logic of the world she had always known. Elena hesitated, her thoughts moving through the moment again, the sound of the crowd, the weight of the coins, the way his presence had stood apart from everything around it. And she realized that the answer was not something she had chosen deliberately, not something she had reasoned through step by step. It had been instinct, a quiet certainty that had risen up and refused to be ignored, because no one else would, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, and the words felt both too small and exactly right at the same time, because they did not explain everything, but they held the truth of what had mattered most in that moment. Something in his expression shifted then, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of recognition or understanding that passed through his eyes before settling back into stillness. And Elena felt her pulse quicken again, not from fear, but from the sense that she had touched on something deeper than she intended, something that connected to him in a way she did not yet fully understand. The chain at his wrist caught her attention again, the faint memory of warmth lingering in her mind, and she glanced down at it briefly before looking back up, the question forming before she could stop it. "What are you?" she asked, the words slipping out quietly, but carrying a weight that hung in the air between them, because she knew now that he was not what he appeared to be, not simply a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He did not answer immediately, and the pause stretched, just long enough to feel intentional, as if he were choosing his response carefully, weighing not just what to say, but how much to reveal. And Elena felt a flicker of uncertainty at that, wondering if she had overstepped, if she had asked something she had no right to know. But then he stepped forward, closing a small part of the distance between them, and the movement was controlled, deliberate, carrying none of the hesitation she might have expected, and the subtle shift in proximity made her acutely aware of the space they shared, of the quiet tension that seemed to gather there. "Someone you should not have chosen," he said, and though the words echoed his earlier statement, there was something different in the way he spoke them now, something that felt less like a warning and more like a truth he could not change. And Elena felt that same flicker in her chest again, stronger this time, because despite everything, despite the uncertainty and the unknown, she did not feel the urge to step back, did not feel the need to undo what had already been done. Instead, she held his gaze, steady and unyielding in a way that surprised even her, because whatever he was, whatever this moment was leading toward, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She had made her choice, and she was not going to take it back. Elena Whitmore did not look away, even as his words settled between them with a weight that should have made her step back, because there was something in the way he said it that did not push her away but instead drew her deeper into the truth he was holding. And she realized with a quiet certainty that whatever he was, whatever danger he might carry, it was not directed at her, not in the way the world had always taught her to expect. The breeze shifted slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair across her cheek, and she tucked it back absently, her attention never leaving him, her thoughts moving through the moment with a strange clarity that felt both new and familiar at the same time. "Maybe," she said slowly, her voice calm despite the tension threading beneath it. "But I did." And the simplicity of her answer seemed to settle into the space between them with a quiet finality, because there was no hesitation left in it now, no uncertainty about whether she would undo her choice. And she saw the faintest change in his expression again, something almost like surprise, though it passed too quickly to fully define. His gaze held hers for a long moment, steady and searching, as if measuring something that could not be seen. And Elena felt that same awareness rise again, that sense of being understood in a way that went beyond words, beyond the small, guarded version of herself she had always presented to the world. "You do not know what you have taken responsibility for," he said, and this time there was a slight shift in his tone, not sharper, not harsher, but heavier, as if the truth behind the words carried more weight than he intended to reveal. And Elena felt a flicker of something tighten in her chest at that, not fear exactly, but an awareness of how little she truly understood. She glanced briefly at the chain still wrapped around his wrist, the dull metal that now felt anything but ordinary, and then back to his face, her brows drawing together slightly as the pieces refused to fit into any explanation she knew. "Then tell me," she said, the words coming more firmly now, not demanding but steady, because she was no longer content to stand in uncertainty, not after stepping this far into something unknown. For a moment he did not respond, and the silence stretched just enough to feel intentional, as if he were weighing the cost of the truth against something unseen. And Elena felt the faint tension build again, her senses sharpening in anticipation of an answer that might change everything she thought she understood. But instead of speaking, he lifted his hand slightly, the movement controlled despite the chain that should have restricted it, and for a brief second she thought he might pull away, might create distance where there was none, but he did not. He simply shifted his wrist enough for the metal to catch the light again, and Elena's attention followed the motion instinctively. "This," he said quietly, his voice dropping just enough to draw her focus closer, "is not what it seems," and the understatement of it sent a faint chill through her, because she already knew that much, had felt it the moment she touched it, but hearing him confirm it made the reality more solid, more immediate. She stepped closer without fully realizing she had done so, her curiosity overriding the hesitation that might have held her back before. And the distance between them narrowed again until she could feel the subtle warmth radiating from him, not overwhelming, not threatening, but present in a way that made her acutely aware of every inch of space they shared. "Then what is it?" she asked, her voice softer now, drawn into the moment in a way that left little room for anything else, and she watched him carefully searching for any sign of what lay beneath the surface he had maintained so carefully. His gaze shifted briefly to her hand, then back to her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the connection she had already felt, the one she could not explain but could not deny either. A restraint, he said, but not for the reasons they believe. And the words settled into her mind with a quiet intensity, because they suggested something far greater than simple captivity, something that turned the entire situation on its head in a way she was only beginning to understand. Elena felt her breath slow slightly, her thoughts aligning around that single idea, and she realized then that this had never been about saving someone weak or helpless, had never been about an act of simple kindness. It had been something else entirely, something that had recognized her as much as she had recognized it. She lifted her gaze fully to his again, her expression steady despite the shift taking place inside her, because whatever this truth was, whatever he was holding back, she was no longer standing outside of it. She was part of it now, and the realization settled into her with a quiet, undeniable weight that changed everything that came next. The words settled between them like a quiet fracture in reality, and Elena Whitmore felt something inside her shift in response, not breaking but realigning, as if the world she thought she understood had tilted just enough to reveal a deeper layer beneath it, and she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself against the unfamiliar weight of that realization, while her eyes remained fixed on the chain at his wrist, no longer seeing it as simple iron but as something deliberate, something placed there with purpose. The faint warmth she had felt before lingered in her memory, and without fully thinking it through, she lifted her hand again, her fingers hovering just inches from the metal as hesitation flickered briefly through her, not from fear, but from the awareness that touching it again might confirm something she was not yet ready to fully understand. He did not move to stop her, did not pull away or warn her, and that quiet allowance was its own kind of answer. And so she let her fingertips brush against the chain once more. The response was immediate, a subtle but undeniable pulse of warmth that traveled through the contact and into her skin, stronger this time, more defined, and her breath caught softly as she felt it move through her like a quiet current, not overwhelming but deeply present, as if it recognized her in a way she could not explain. She looked up sharply, her gaze locking onto his, searching for confirmation, and what she found there was not surprise but something far more unsettling. A calm acceptance that told her he had expected this, that whatever connection she was feeling was not one-sided, not accidental. "You feel it," he said, not as a question but as a statement, his voice low and steady, and Elena swallowed, her throat tightening slightly as she nodded, because denying it would have been impossible, the sensation too real, too precise to dismiss. "What is it?" she asked again, her voice quieter now, drawn inward by the intensity of the moment, and she became acutely aware of everything around them fading further into the background, the distant voices, the movement of the streets, all of it dissolving into something distant and unimportant compared to the space they occupied. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as if weighing something unseen, and she felt that same sense of being measured, not in judgment but in recognition, as though he were confirming something that had already been set in motion long before she understood it. "A bond," he said finally, and the word landed softly but carried a weight that echoed through her chest, because it explained everything and nothing all at once, a single answer that opened more questions than it closed. Elena's brows drew together slightly as she processed it, the idea settling into her thoughts with a quiet persistence, because she had heard of bonds before, whispers of them in stories and distant conversations, but those had always felt abstract, removed from her reality, something that belonged to others, not to her. "That is not possible," she said though. The certainty in her voice faltered slightly under the weight of what she had already experienced, because she could not deny the evidence of her own senses, could not dismiss the connection that had sparked so clearly between them. He did not argue, did not try to convince her, and that lack of insistence made the truth feel even more solid, as if it did not need validation to exist. "It was not supposed to happen like this," he replied instead, and there was something in his tone now, something deeper, more complex, and Elena felt her pulse quicken at the implication behind his words, because it suggested intention, design, something planned that had shifted in a way neither of them had expected. She stepped back slightly, not to create distance but to take in the moment more fully, her mind racing as the pieces began to align in ways that unsettled and fascinated her at the same time. Because if this was a bond, if what she felt was real, then her choice at the market had not been random, had not been a simple act of compassion. It had been something else entirely, something guided by a force she had not recognized. Then what was supposed to happen? She asked, her voice steadier now as she pushed past the uncertainty, because she needed to understand, needed to know what she had stepped into. His gaze held hers, unflinching, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single point of connection, the space between them charged with something quiet and powerful. "You were not meant to find me," he said, and the words carried a weight that settled deeply into her chest, because they suggested that everything about this moment, every step that had led her here, had defied something larger than either of them. And Elena felt that realization take hold, not as fear, but as something far more profound, a sense that her life had just shifted onto a path she could not yet see the end of, but one she would not turn away from. The words lingered in Elena Whitmore's mind long after he spoke them, echoing in a quiet, unsettling rhythm that she could not ignore, because if she was not meant to find him, then everything that had led her to that moment could not be dismissed as coincidence. And the realization settled into her chest with a strange, steady weight. Not fear, but something deeper, something that felt like the edge of understanding she had not yet reached. She drew in a slow breath, her fingers curling slightly at her sides as she tried to steady the rush of thoughts moving through her, each one circling back to the same question, the same quiet disbelief that refused to fully take shape. "Then why did I?" she asked softly, her voice carrying more curiosity than doubt now, because somewhere beneath the uncertainty there was a growing sense that this was not random, not meaningless, and she needed to understand the force that had pulled her here. He did not answer immediately, and the pause stretched long enough for her to become aware of the world again, the distant hum of voices, the movement of people passing at the edges of her awareness, but it all felt distant, blurred, as if she stood just outside of it while something far more significant unfolded in the space between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, more measured, as if each word carried a weight he could not easily set aside. "Because you listened," he said, and the simplicity of the answer caught her off guard, because it did not explain anything in the way she expected, did not provide a clear reason or a logical path. And yet it resonated in a way she could not dismiss, because she had felt it, that quiet pull, that instinct. She had chosen to follow despite every reason not to. Elena's brows drew together slightly as she considered his words, her thoughts shifting as she tried to grasp something that did not fit into the structure she had always relied on. And for a moment, she felt the familiar urge to question herself, to doubt the choice she had made. But it did not take hold the way it once would have, because the connection she felt now, the bond he had named, was too real to ignore. "And now?" she asked, her voice steadier, more grounded, because whatever uncertainty remained, it no longer controlled her, and she lifted her chin slightly as she met his gaze again, refusing to retreat into the quiet, invisible version of herself she had spent years becoming. His eyes held hers, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in them, something that went beyond calm observation or quiet recognition, something that carried the faintest edge of inevitability, and it made her breath catch before she could stop it. "Now it changes everything," he said, and the weight of the statement settled over her like a slow, steady current, not overwhelming but impossible to resist, and she felt it move through her, aligning something inside her that had been waiting, something she had not known how to name until this moment. The chain at his wrist shifted slightly as he moved his hand, not pulling away but adjusting the angle as if to show her more clearly, and Elena's attention followed the motion instinctively, her awareness narrowing to that single point where metal met skin. "This was meant to hold me," he continued, his voice even, controlled, "to suppress what I am," and the words sent a quiet ripple through her, because they confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that the chain was not just a restraint, but something designed with purpose, something meant to contain rather than simply confine. She looked back up at him, her pulse quickening again as the implications settled into place. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the weight of what she was about to ask. Because she knew the answer would change everything she thought she understood about him. "And what are you?" she asked, her voice soft but unwavering. Because she was no longer willing to stand in uncertainty, not when the truth was this close, this tangible. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, deeper, more deliberate. And Elena felt the air shift slightly, as if the moment itself was holding its breath, waiting. His gaze did not leave hers, and for a long second neither of them moved. The connection between them steady and unbroken, and then he stepped closer, closing the distance in a way that felt intentional, final. "The one they should not have put in chains," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice carried more weight than any title or explanation could have. And Elena felt the truth of it settle into her, not as something she needed to question, but as something she already knew, something she had recognized the moment she first saw him, even if she had not understood it then. Her heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with the growing awareness that whatever she had stepped into, whatever path had opened before her, there was no turning back now, because the bond between them had already taken hold, and the world she had known before this moment was already beginning to fade into something distant and unreal. The air seemed to still around them after his words, as if the world itself had paused to recognize what had just been revealed. And Elena Whitmore felt it settle into her bones with a quiet certainty that went beyond understanding, because she did not need a title or a name to know that whatever stood before her was something far greater than what the market had tried to reduce him to. Her breath came slower now, steadier, as the initial shock gave way to something deeper, something more grounded, and she realized with a faint sense of awe that she was not afraid, not in the way she should have been, not standing this close to something powerful enough to be restrained by forces she could not yet comprehend. Instead, there was a calm resolve building inside her, a quiet acceptance of the path she had already stepped onto. "Then they were wrong," she said softly, the words leaving her without hesitation. And as soon as she spoke them, she felt the truth of them settle into place. Not as defiance, but as simple recognition, because whatever he was, whatever they had tried to contain, it did not belong in chains, and she had seen that from the very beginning. His gaze held hers, and for the first time there was no distance left in it, no measured restraint, only a clear, undeniable acknowledgement of her presence. And it sent a subtle warmth through her chest that matched the connection she had felt earlier, as if something between them had shifted again, becoming more defined, more real. "You see more than you should," he said, and though the words could have carried warning, there was something else beneath them, something quieter, almost like respect, and Elena felt a small, steady strength rise in response, because for once, seeing clearly did not feel like a weakness. It felt like the only truth that mattered. She glanced again at the chain, at the way it rested against his skin, no longer just a restraint but a symbol of something far larger, and her mind returned to the warmth she had felt, the pulse that had answered her touch, and a thought began to take shape. Tentative at first, then stronger as it aligned with everything she had experienced. "It is reacting to me," she said, her voice thoughtful now, more certain with each word, and when she looked back up at him, she saw the slight shift in his expression, the confirmation she had been searching for without needing it spoken aloud. "Yes," he said simply, and the weight of that single word settled into her with quiet clarity, because it meant the connection was not imagined, not one-sided, it was real, and it was changing something fundamental about the situation they stood in. Elena's pulse quickened slightly as she processed it, her thoughts moving quickly now, connecting pieces that had not made sense before, and she realized that if the chain was meant to suppress him, to hold something within him in check, and if it was responding to her, then her presence was not neutral, it was active. It was influencing something she did not yet fully understand. She hesitated for only a moment, before stepping closer again, drawn by the same quiet instinct that had guided her from the beginning. And this time there was no uncertainty in her movement, only intention. Her hand lifted once more, her fingers brushing against the chain with a steadier touch, and the response was immediate, stronger than before, a warmth that spread more clearly through her skin, moving upward along her arm in a way that made her breath catch softly. Not in fear, but in recognition, because this was no longer subtle, no longer something she could question or doubt. She looked up at him again, her eyes searching his with a new intensity, because she understood now that this moment mattered, that whatever was happening here was not small, not insignificant. What happens if it breaks? She asked, the question forming naturally from the realization that had just taken hold. And though her voice remained calm, there was a quiet gravity behind it, because she knew the answer would change everything. He did not look away, did not hesitate, and the certainty in his gaze matched the weight of her question, as if he had already considered it long before she asked. Then I am no longer contained, he said. And the simplicity of the statement carried a depth that sent a quiet ripple through her, because it was not a threat, not a warning, but a fact, one that existed regardless of what either of them chose to do next. Elena felt her heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the realization of what she held in her hands. Because if the bond between them was real, if her presence was already affecting the chain, then she was not just part of this moment. She was the reason it could change. And the weight of that settled into her with a quiet, undeniable force. She did not pull her hand away, did not step back, because whatever this was, whatever it meant, she had already made her choice, and she could feel it now more clearly than ever, not as a single decision in a crowded market, but as something ongoing, something that was still unfolding with each breath she took, with each moment she chose to stay exactly where she was. The warmth beneath Elena Whitmore's fingers did not fade this time. It deepened, spreading in a slow, deliberate pulse that seemed to answer her presence rather than resist it, and she felt it travel up her arm with a quiet certainty that made her breath steady instead of quicken, because something inside her recognized it, not as danger, but as alignment, as if two separate currents had finally met and begun to move in the same direction. She did not pull away, did not hesitate, and the world beyond them seemed to fall even further into silence, the distant sounds of the street dimming into something irrelevant as the space between them became the only thing that mattered. His gaze never left her, and there was something different in it now, something that had shifted from observation into acknowledgement, deeper and more personal than anything before, and it made her chest tighten slightly with a feeling she could not fully name but did not want to escape. "You are not afraid," he said quietly, and the words were not a question, not even a statement meant to challenge her, but an observation spoken with a kind of certainty that left no room for denial. And Elena realized in that moment that he was right, because whatever fears she might have expected had never taken hold, had never found a place to settle within her. She shook her head faintly, her eyes still locked on his, her voice soft but unwavering as she answered, "No." And the simplicity of it felt stronger than any explanation she could have offered, because it was not a choice she had made. It was something she simply knew. The chain beneath her hand shifted again, not in resistance, but in response. And she felt the subtle change as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat, a faint loosening that sent a quiet ripple through her awareness, and her fingers pressed slightly more firmly against the metal without conscious thought, drawn by the instinct that had guided her from the very beginning. His breath changed then, just enough for her to notice, a subtle shift that carried more weight than any visible reaction, and it made her pulse echo in answer. Because whatever was happening here was no longer contained within simple explanation, it was something unfolding in real time, something neither of them could fully control. "If you continue," he said, his voice lower now, carrying a depth that had not been there before, "there will be no return to what you were." And the words settled into her with quiet clarity, not as a warning but as a truth she needed to understand. And for a brief moment, she felt the edge of hesitation rise, the faint echo of the life she had known, the safety of staying small, unseen, untouched by forces beyond her control. But it passed just as quickly as it came, because standing here, feeling the connection between them, she realized that there was nothing left for her to return to, that the girl she had been had already begun to fade the moment she stepped forward in that market, and what remained now was something new, something she was only beginning to understand. She lifted her gaze fully to his, her expression steady, her voice quiet but certain as she spoke. "I already crossed that line." and the truth of it settled between them with a finality that did not need to be questioned, because there was no hesitation left in her now, no uncertainty about the path she had chosen. Something in his expression shifted again, deeper this time, more pronounced, and for the first time there was no restraint in it, no careful distance held in place, only a clear, undeniable recognition of her as part of this moment, part of whatever was unfolding between them. The chain responded again, the warmth intensifying slightly under her touch, and she felt it give just enough to confirm what she already sensed, that it was not unbreakable, not fixed in place as it had been meant to be. Her breath came slower, more controlled, as she focused on the sensation, on the connection that seemed to guide her without words, and she realized that this was not about force, not about strength. It was about alignment, about something deeper that the chain had not been designed to withstand. "Then do not stop," he said, and the quiet command carried none of the dominance she might have expected, only trust, and it settled into her with a weight that made her chest tighten again, because he was not asking, not testing, he was choosing to place that moment in her hands. Elena did not hesitate this time, her fingers pressing more firmly against the metal as she let the connection guide her, let the warmth spread fully through her awareness, and the response was immediate, a deeper shift that moved through the chain and into the space between them, subtle but undeniable, and she felt it resonate through her in a way that made everything else fade completely. Her eyes lifted to his once more, and in that moment there was no distance left between what she felt and what she understood, only a single, steady truth that settled into her with quiet certainty, that whatever this bond was, whatever it meant, it had already begun to change them both, and there was no turning back from it now. The moment Elena Whitmore pressed her hand fully against the chain, something changed in a way that could not be undone. The warmth no longer a pulse but a steady current flowing between them, deep and undeniable, and she felt it settle into her like a second heartbeat, quiet but powerful, as if something ancient and waiting had finally found its answer. Her breath slowed, her senses sharpening as the world beyond them seemed to fall away completely, the distant sounds of the street fading into nothing, leaving only the space they occupied and the connection that now bound them together in a way that no words could fully explain. The metal beneath her palm shifted again, not with resistance, but with a subtle release, a quiet yielding that sent a ripple through her awareness, and she felt it clearly this time. The moment where something designed to hold began to fail, not from force but from something deeper, something it had not been made to withstand. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and what she found there was no longer restraint, no longer careful control, but something far more profound, a presence that filled the space around him with quiet authority, and it made her chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that she was standing at the center of something far greater than herself. "It is happening," he said, his voice low, steady, and carrying a depth that resonated with the change she felt beneath her hand, and Elena nodded faintly, because she could feel it too, could sense the shift as clearly as she felt her own breath, the slow unraveling of something that had been bound for reasons she was only beginning to understand. The chain loosened further, the metal no longer rigid against his skin, but giving way in small, deliberate increments, and she felt each change as it happened, each subtle release echoing through the bond that connected them. And it made her pulse steady rather than quicken, because this was no longer uncertain, no longer something she questioned. It was real, it was happening, and she was part of it. Her fingers tightened, slightly, not in fear but in focus, as if holding on to the moment itself, and the warmth surged in response, stronger now, more defined, spreading through her with a clarity that made everything else fade completely, leaving only the connection and the quiet understanding that had taken hold within her. He stepped closer then, closing the remaining distance between them until there was nothing left but the space they shared, and Elena became acutely aware of his presence in a way she had not been before, not overwhelming, not consuming, but undeniable, like standing near something vast and powerful that did not need to prove itself. "You are the key," he said, and the words settled into her with a weight that felt both unfamiliar and entirely right, because she had felt it from the beginning, that this was not random, not accidental, and hearing it spoken aloud only confirmed what she already knew. She swallowed softly, her gaze steady as she met his, and though the idea of it should have felt overwhelming, it did not. It felt inevitable, as if this moment had been waiting for her long before she understood it. The chain gave again, a more pronounced shift this time, and she felt it clearly, the point where restraint turned into release, where something held in place began to move freely, and the air around them seemed to change with it, growing still and heavy with a presence that had not been there before. Elena did not step back, did not pull away, because there was nothing in her that wanted to retreat, nothing that told her she had made a mistake, only a quiet certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Her hand remained steady against the metal as the final resistance began to give, the warmth surging once more in a way that made her breath catch softly, not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the moment, because this was the point where everything shifted, where the line between what had been and what would come next finally broke. She lifted her gaze to his one last time before it happened, and in that moment there was no doubt left between them, no uncertainty, only a shared understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together, because the bond had already taken hold, and there was no separating what had been joined. The chain loosened fully under her hand, no longer holding, no longer containing, and the change that followed was immediate, not loud or violent, but deep and absolute. A quiet release that carried more weight than any force could have, and Elena felt it settle into her with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Because in that moment she knew, without question, that everything had just changed. The moment the chain gave way completely, the world did not explode into chaos the way Elena Whitmore might have imagined. It did not shatter or roar or demand attention. Instead, it shifted in something far quieter and far more profound, as if the very air around them had taken a deeper breath, as if something long restrained had simply stepped back into itself without needing to announce its return. And Elena felt it first, not with her eyes but within her chest, a sudden expansion of awareness that spread outward like a ripple through still water. Her hand remained where it was for a heartbeat longer, pressed against what was no longer a restraint, but only cold metal without purpose. And then she slowly lowered it, her fingers trembling slightly not from fear, but from the weight of what she had just done, what she had just allowed. Because even without visible spectacle, she knew the difference. Knew that the presence standing before her was no longer contained, no longer limited by something external. She lifted her gaze to him, and what she saw there made her breath still, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was finally complete. The quiet control that had once held him in place now replaced with something deeper, something more expansive, a presence that did not need to prove itself because it simply was, and it filled the space around him in a way that made everything else feel smaller, distant, almost irrelevant. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer uncertain but steady, grounded in something that had already been decided. And Elena became aware of her own heartbeat, slow and even, matching the calm that had settled over her, because whatever had changed here had not created fear within her. It had created clarity. "It is done," he said quietly, and the words did not carry triumph or relief, only truth. A simple acknowledgement of what had already taken place, and Elena nodded faintly, because she felt it too, felt the absence of resistance where there had once been tension, felt the bond between them settle into something stable and undeniable. The distant sounds of the world began to return slowly. The murmur of voices, the movement of people passing by unaware of what had just shifted in their midst, and Elena realized with a quiet sense of wonder that nothing outward had marked the moment. No one had noticed, and yet everything had changed in a way that could not be undone. He stepped forward then, closing the final distance between them, and this time there was no barrier left, no restraint to define the space they shared. And Elena felt the difference immediately, the connection between them no longer filtered or muted but clear, direct, and steady, like a thread that had been pulled tight and finally aligned. She did not step back, did not hesitate, because there was nothing in her that wanted distance, nothing that told her she had made a mistake, only a quiet understanding that this was the moment everything had been leading toward. His gaze held hers, and for the first time there was no question left in it, no uncertainty about what she was to him, and it made her chest tightened slightly as something unspoken passed between them, something deeper than words, something that had already been decided the moment she chose to step forward in that crowded market. "You changed the course of something that was not meant to be altered," he said, and though the words could have carried warning, they did not. They carried recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the role she had played. And Elena felt a faint warmth rise in response, not from pride, but from the simple truth of it. Because she had not acted for power or purpose, she had acted because she could not turn away. She drew in a slow breath, her voice steady as she answered. Then it needed to change, and the certainty in her tone surprised even her, because it was not something she had reasoned out. It was something she knew, something that had settled into her the moment she made her choice.